Welcome to a new episode with Astrid, your APD. And today, Dr. Jade Teta. We're going to talk about different topics, and one of those is PCOS, cellulite, insulin resistance, hashimotos, and hypothyroidism. And let's get right into it. There are quite a few questions that we've come up with that they are very, very common because he is amazing. Really comes down to what works for you and how better you can adhere to it. You ready?
I'm all set. It's good to see you. I always love hanging out with you.
Oh, I love that too. So let's get right into one of the first topics, which is cellulite. I think most of the times this topic is such a great deal, especially for women. What causes it? What would you say is the biggest impacts on the appearance of this problem?
Well, first of all, the true answer, and the one that's not really popular, is that cellulite is largely genetic. And so let's go through that really quickly. And there are big gender differences here. There are big biological differences between the sexes. And one of those big biological differences happens to be the way collagen works in the body. So women, their collagen tends to be a little bit more up and down. The way we describe it is almost like a picket fence. You know, these straight collagen lines that go basically from the muscle, let's say, or the fascial layer up to the skin. Now in men, it's more chain linked like this, right? It crisscrosses a little bit. Now you can imagine if your collagen is like this, fat can build up in these pockets, right? If it's like this, not so much. And so some women are a little bit more like men in their collagen distribution, and some women are a little bit more like the pure picket fence, right? And so this is the major difference that's happening. Now you can imagine if you have collagen that's running vertical like that, it creates little pockets. And so then fluid can build up in these pockets and fat can build up in these pockets, almost corralled into these pockets. And so as you begin to gain fat inside this collagen sort of network, you start getting puckering on the skin. And so you start getting this dimpling appearance. Now, one of the interesting things about this, so that explains that this is not really a fat issue, it's more of a collagen issue, which means there's not a whole lot we can do with collagen for the most part. There are all kinds of sort of spa treatments that people talk about, remodeling collagen. The science on this is really not very sound. And so far we have to say there's no great way to, get this collagen distribution to change. So that leaves us with decreasing fat, and also one more thing, which is strengthening and building muscle underneath the layer of connective tissue. Because remember, connective tissue basically runs from the skin down to the muscle, and then it also runs horizontally and vertically. And so if you can make that muscle, at least the theory goes, tighter, build up that muscle, what happens is it pulls on that collagen, making it a little bit more structured and sound and stable, and hopefully can flatten out the dimpling that you see on the skin. This might be, and I say may because again, cellulite is one of these areas that we don't know a whole lot about, but it may be one of the reasons why women who train with weights tend to seem to have less appearance of cellulite. This is also, by the way, if you understand that, it's also one of the reasons why when you do like spa therapies and things like that, you can have, or even a hot bath, right? You can have local reduction for a little while in the appearance of cellulite just because fluid moves out of that area. So if you do hot, cold compresses on a particular area, you're going to move fluid out of that area. And so it's going to be less dimpling, but it's only a transitory effect at best. So the best we have is to burn fat and build muscle, which is where you and I make a lot of our living, talking about this all of the time. And this is probably the best that we can do. Now, certainly I'm not going to say don't do things like, some of this collagen remodeling stuff. Basically, if you guys want to know what this is, if you go to like a spa, they'll have these little vacuum and massage devices that they'll essentially put on your tissue and run up and down it and do things like if you've ever had Graston technique or you ever done like really firm foam rolling or deep tissue, it's a deep tissue massage. It's a lot like that. we just don't have any data that suggests that's actually going to remodel collagen to make it more, mesh-like. But it certainly can, for a short period of time, probably reduce the appearance of cellulite. So the end result here is each woman has a different genetic propensity, and the ways to attack this are going to be mainly through fat loss and muscle gain. So the old stuff that no one likes to talk about, caloric deficits, weight training, this is how it's pretty much done. There's really no magic here, but hopefully that gives everyone a little bit of the science behind cellulite.
I have a question that really comes across very often, and is that whether cellulite would be similar to a stubborn fat. Is it the same?
Well, that's really interesting, right? Because actually, when we talk about stubborn fat, this is a whole other sort of issue, right? This gets into another issue between men and women. When we talk about stubborn fat, typically we're talking hips, butt, thighs on women, maybe back of the arms on women, and we're talking, the love handles on men. So what exactly is stubborn fat? Let's talk about that first. Stubborn fat is essentially fat that burns more slowly than maybe the rest of the fat on the body. So you say, well, Jade, how does that work? Well, we have fat-burning hormones, the catecholamines, that bind to receptors in the fat tissue, and they will stimulate the fat to release some of its fat stores. Now, there's two types of receptors associated with fat tissue. One is alpha receptors, and the other is beta receptors. So to remember this, think B for beta, burn. When you hit the beta receptors, they burn fast. That fat burns a little more quickly. But when you, sort of interact with the alpha receptors, think A for anti-burn. It burns a little bit more slowly. It burns, but it's just slowly. It's kind of like having a big garage door to get the fat out of, or a little tiny kitchen window to get the fat out of. The alpha receptors are the tiny kitchen window, and the beta receptors are the big, sort of garage door. So with stubborn fat, what happens is there's more alpha receptors associated with that fat tissue. We know that women have a higher density of alpha receptors in the hips, butt, and thighs, some of the same places where cellulite shows up. So then the issue is, well, Jade, how can we burn this fat a little faster? Well, there's certain things that turn on alpha receptors. Certainly insulin will. So high insulin states seem to accentuate alpha receptors. If you're not doing intense exercise, you can't stimulate the beta receptors as well. And by the way, in all these tissues, there's alpha and beta receptors. It's just the proportion of them. So women tend to have a little more alpha receptors in those stubborn areas. Men have it actually a little more in their love handles. And actually, there's actually another thing here too. These areas are a little bit more colder, meaning there's not as well perfused with blood. So that figures into stubborn fat as well. But the idea here is, well, how can we speed these things up? We can speed them up by decreasing insulin sort of exposure. And by the way, I know you know this, Astrid, and you'd probably yell at me if I didn't cover this, so I'll cover it here. For those of you who are hearing me talk about insulin, it's very wrong to be thinking about insulin as the primary fat burning or storing hormone. It is involved, but it cannot do anything without calories. The two are linked. They're not separate. So you can't burn fat just with lower insulin without lower calories as well, and vice versa. So when I usually talk about insulin, I'm really talking about calories. And when I'm talking about calories, I'm kind of talking about insulin. The two go hand in hand. However, for someone who's very lean and really wanted to get rid of this stubborn fat, one of the things they can do is to try to decrease their insulin as much as possible, as well as their calories. Because when we talk about insulin levels, higher insulin levels in a calorie deficit, you're still going to burn fat. You just might burn a little bit more muscle as well. Higher insulin levels in a calorie excess, you're still going to gain fat. You just may gain a little bit more of it. And so this is the game we're playing. The other thing here is thyroid hormone gets in on the action here as well, because the thyroid gland and thyroid hormone will stimulate, suppress alpha and ramp up beta a little bit. And so we're really talking here about insulin and thyroid production, which is one of the reasons why when I'm dealing with stubborn fat, this mainly happens with very lean individuals, by the way. These are people going on stage, right? They're going to show off their physiques, and we get them very, very lean, and then we start attacking these very stubborn areas. At this point, this is when we start doing very low insulin diets towards the very end, where we're essentially doing mainly protein and or fat with no carbohydrate at all. And we're also stimulating thyroid. And the way I like to do that, certainly you could take thyroid hormone. Many of these people do, but one of the lesser known ways to stimulate thyroid production is through hot and cold therapies, getting in a hot bath, going into cold water, and alternating those two things. This turns on TSH, it turns on the ability for T4 to convert to T3, and it may even have some benefits on thyroid receptor sensitivity. And this is partly because thyroid is so involved in maintaining our temperature regulation through the hypothalamus pituitary thyroid axis. And so these are the major things that we want to do here with stubborn fat. And of course, something that has nothing to do with burning fat at all, which is building muscle around these areas. One of the reasons why a lot of people have loose skin or the appearance of cellulite or lots of fat in these areas is because they actually don't do the amount of work required through weight training and things like that to build up these areas to make them firm in the first place. So if you don't have firm legs and good muscular development in your legs and your buttocks and stuff like that, it doesn't matter, right? You're still going to look a little bit flabby in that area, even if you were very lean. And a lot of lean women understand this, right? We tend to refer to it as skinny fat or flabby fat. You still need to build that muscle up if you want that look. Just burning fat isn't going to give you the look you want in those stubborn areas. You're also going to have to put on some muscle as well. So those would be the things that I would say. If you want to get just a little bit more into the science, I'll mention one more thing. There are some supplements, and I never like to mention supplements, and Astrid is probably like saying, oh my God, Jay, don't go here, because I know she's also like me and doesn't love the supplements. But there are some supplements that can amplify the alpha or beta receptors and suppress the alpha receptors. Coleus for scoli is one. Yohimbine is another one. And so these, and green tea extract too has some of these. But these effects are so weak that unless you are doing all the other things that I'm talking about, calorie deficits, low insulin states, and that kind of stuff, training with weights, just taking these supplements by themselves, doing nothing else, is not going to make one bit of difference in your stubborn fat. However, if you're doing everything else right, they can make a little bit of a difference. And I would say, you might say, well, Jade, what would be the difference? Over an 8-week period, maybe you'll get an extra 2 pounds of weight loss and maybe an extra pound of fat loss from these particular areas, which is significant, but that's a guess, by the way, right? It's just based on clinical experience. I have no research to really back that up. But I don't want people going, oh, I'm going to go take these supplements. You have to do these other things first. And if you're doing those other things, you may not need the supplements at all.
I have now 2 follow-up questions to that. So is there any difference when we talk about menopausal women where insulin probably is a little bit more unstable or a little bit higher, cortisol as well going on, more stress? In these situations, is there the same approach? Would you use the same approach, or is there something mechanistically different happening?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because, and I'm glad you asked this question. You're leading me. I left out one big part of this picture. Estrogen actually amplifies alpha receptor activity. So not just the amount of estrogen that you have in exposure sort of when you are younger, but also right around the menstrual cycle. There's certain periods of the menstrual cycle where estrogen is elevated. And so if you really wanted to get savvy with this, you want to do your fat burning stuff when estrogen is at its lowest, which would be right during menses and the week before menses. So premenstrually and the week of menses. This would be the time where you'd really want to attack your diet and create the greatest calorie deficits to try to burn off this stubborn fat. Estrogen also has a negative impact. So there's several different mechanisms here. Estrogen has a negative impact on thyroid a little bit, and estrogen also ramps up the alpha receptor. So that was a big piece of the story I left out. Now with menopause, these women actually lose their estrogen levels, right? So their estrogen levels plummet. So in that regard, that's a good thing. However, when you're talking about hormones, there's always 10 different mechanisms you're not aware of. Another thing that estrogen does is sensitize the body to insulin. And so a woman who loses estrogen also loses her natural insulin sort of sensitivity. And so it becomes much more difficult for people in menopause. However, there's just one trick, and it's actually a simple trick for women in menopause. Just realize that without estrogen, you are far more sensitive to protein and carbohydrates' ability to stimulate insulin. And therefore, you might want to be looking at those two macronutrients in a different way. We probably wouldn't want to take protein because it's such a satiating macronutrient. So that leaves taking away carbohydrates. And so one of the major things there is the one sort of caveat I would say for menopausal women is they're usually thinking about calories when they're younger. They might be able to get away with that. But as you hit menopause, if you really want to do this, you might want to focus a little bit more on your reduction of calories through the reduction of carbohydrates. And that will play a role. By the way, cortisol, many people may know this, but glucocorticoids, including prednisone, make you hold water. So high cortisol states are going to make you hold a little bit more water under the tissue. That's going to amplify the way something like cellulite looks. That's one of, sort of the mechanisms here. And so there's a lot going on. And by the way, estrogen and progesterone, estrogen antagonizes thyroid. We probably think progesterone probably accentuates thyroid. So progesterone's a little bit better for this, perhaps, but it still comes down to insulin being the biggest influence. For the women listening to this, one of the things that I think women get confused on is they go, oh, my hormones are out of balance. And when they think hormones, they're thinking estrogen and progesterone. Well, there are other hormones that are far more important, like insulin and cortisol, and like thyroid and adrenal hormones. They're far more important to your fat loss efforts than estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone are just weak influencers, but insulin is a very big one. So is cortisol. And the way estrogen and progesterone work anyway is against those two sort of bigger hormones, if that makes sense. So hopefully, I know I'm getting a little technical, but I hope those of you who are listening are following this.
That leads to another question that I really wanted to ask you about, which is, you sort of touched on that really closely right now, which is, can the stress, excessive carb intake or sodium intake, or even some days around the menstrual cycle, maybe PMS, around the late luteal phase or earlier follicular phase, can that worsen the cellulite, like accumulation of water? Or like sometimes I've heard, and in my particular case, I can feel sometimes that some kind of pain in those areas, probably related to the cellulite and accumulation of water. I don't know. What do you say about that?
Yeah, well, think about it, right? One of the things is, I think you're absolutely right in this. One of the things that happens with around menses is cravings and hunger go up. And oftentimes cravings for the very foods we're talking about avoiding. Things that are rich in carbohydrates and rich in salt, primarily. Palatable foods. These same foods, if you think about what carbohydrate does in the body when we store carbohydrate, think about oatmeal and putting water in oatmeal and how it expands. Water, glucose in our body pulls water with it. Glycogen is like a sponge. And so for every gram of glycogen you have, you get about 3 grams of water, 2 to 3 grams of water that come with it. Same with sodium. The more sodium you have in your body, the more water is pulled in it. By the way, insulin makes you hold on to sodium, so does cortisol, right? And so estrogen and progesterone go away at menses. That makes you crave more of these highly palatable foods. So you're probably taking in more sodium and carbs in the first place. Meanwhile, cortisol and insulin are up at that time, and estrogen and progesterone aren't balancing them as well. And so what happens then, you're holding on to more sodium, holding on to more glucose, and you can get this swelling effect. And many women will actually feel sore to the touch during this time, especially women who get very lean and then have all this water come sort of back in to the tissue. It can actually feel tender to the touch, and that is definitely playing a role here. As a matter of fact, almost all of these things at spa places and things like that claim to decrease the appearance of cellulite, all they are is local dehydrating agents. Things like caffeine and wraps and heat and all this stuff that's basically getting fluid out of the tissue. It's transitory. All that will come back in. If you want to make it last, you want to be aware of these things. So you're absolutely right. There's something going on there, and it does matter for sure.
Okay, awesome. Let's move to PCOS, which is another big one. And I guess you and I get a lot of questions about this topic as well. And this is a topic that usually gets a lot of, there's a lot of controversial advice, because sometimes there seems not to be a clear answer of certain things. And there seems to be like a lot of practitioners seems to tell you, well, just cut dairy, cut gluten, just don't eat carbohydrates, go vegan, just so much crazy advice, but not necessarily something that is going to be applicable or actually help the client to stay sustainably improving their PCOS. So the first thing that probably we get asked a lot is, what really causes PCOS? Is it gaining weight? Is it external factors? Or is it genetics? Is always all the above? What is it?
Yeah, the answer, I know everyone's going to hate this answer, but the answer is we don't actually know what is causing this condition. We just have some general ideas. What we think is probably clear is that despite the fact that PCOS is synonymous with insulin resistance, even in lean, people with lean PCOS, it seems to be one of these things that probably isn't as food related as we think it is in terms of a causative agent. Now, of course, food becomes a primary thing when you start to treat PCOS. But I think this idea that it's just caused by overeating and obesity probably isn't necessarily true. What's probably more true, and by the way, this is a guess, so Astrid and I may next year be having the same conversation and saying, hey, remember we talked about PCOS and we thought it was this and now we sort of know it's this. What is probably going on is the command and control center of the metabolism is an area of the brain called the hypothalamus. You could think about this as an antenna that's basically out there looking up outside of the body through temperature sensations and light through the eyes and timing of the seasons and all this stuff, picking up all this information. Essentially, it's picking up stress. And something happens with the hypothalamus because once it picks up that stress, and by the way, not only is it picking up all the signals from the outside world, the hypothalamus is picking up all the signals from the inside world, from the adipose tissue and the muscle tissue, and all these cells are also saying, hey, brain, we need this or that. And the brain is going, okay, well, my cells need this or that. Here's what's going on in the outside world. What's the right response? The hypothalamus then sends a signal to the pituitary, which then sends downstream signals to the adrenal glands, the thyroid, and the gonads, in the case of women, ovaries. This is where this PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, comes from. Many of these women are having dysregulation in follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone, which signal to the ovaries. And what ends up happening is these follicles in the ovary that are receiving these signals, they begin, and my lights are dropping out here, so I'm probably going to get dark here in a minute, but hopefully you guys can still see me. But what ends up happening is this hypothalamus begins to send these signals, and the ovaries are no longer responding appropriately, because in order for them to respond and the hypothalamus to do what it needs to do, the ovaries have to signal back. It's all like one big thermostat. So something happens at the level of maybe the hypothalamus that disrupts this signal, which then disrupts the ovarian production of their hormones, which changes everything at the level of the hypothalamus. Now, here's why PCOS is such a difficult thing to deal with. Because think about this. The hypothalamus is not just about the ovaries. It's communicating with the thyroid gland and adrenals. And this is why these people have hypothyroid symptoms and adrenal fatigue symptoms and libido issues, and you end up seeing ovaries, are cysts on the ovaries. It's a multifactorial sort of condition. So what is the smoking gun? It's some type of stress on the hypothalamus. Now that stress could be over-exercising or under-exercising. That stress could be overeating or under-eating. That stress could be a chronic infectious agent like Epstein-Barr virus. That could be some kind of inflammatory condition that's coming from dysbiotic gut. It could be all of this along with a genetic propensity to not be able to receive and send these signals. And so we're dealing with a condition that's multifactorial that looks like many, many different things, and we don't necessarily know the cause. And so what that leaves us doing as functional medicine practitioners and conventional doctors is we tend to go and attack certain areas. Oh, we'll treat the adrenals. Or, oh, we'll treat the thyroid. Or, oh, we'll give something to deal with the ovaries. When the most success I have ever had with this condition focuses on the hypothalamus as a primary means, and also works to decrease stress in general. And when I say stress, I don't mean emotional stress, just emotional stress. I mean stress from inflammatory agents. I mean stress from toxic agents. I mean stress from over and under exercising. I mean stress from over and under eating. And this is how the metabolism works. It works in a Goldilocks zone. So the quick answer is we don't know what causes this. The complex answer is the one I just gave you.
Sounds like a complex answer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I really think that also, and it seems like to be now more like a conventional ideology, that PCOS is probably more like a metabolic disorder.
Yes.
Or someone seems to be heading to that concept rather than actually pointing to the actual ovaries to be the blame, or the specific cysts in the ovaries. Mm-hmm. So what would you say about that?
Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly right. And so the things that you want to focus on when you're dealing with PCOS in yourself, or you're talking to a friend that has this condition, is to try to understand the stress load on the metabolism and start to address some of the signals that are being sent to the hypothalamus. So this is one of the reasons why one of the major things that we use with PCOS in functional medicine is something called chasteberry or vitex. And a lot of people think we're using that. They tend to see that as an herb for the ovaries. It's really an herb, and it's an adaptogen. It really works at the level of the hypothalamus and tends to have some progesterogenic and estrogenic effects on its own. And it can really do wonders for the hypothalamus. But adaptogens in general are one big clinical pearl. So these are things like using ashwagandha, which is an adaptogen that works in the hypothalamus and leans a little bit more towards thyroid function, or rhodiola, which works on the hypothalamus but leans a little bit more towards adrenal function. Remember, if you're following this, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, hypothalamus, pituitary, ovary. We want all these pathways, and all of these seem to be disrupted in PCOS, and it comes along with insulin resistance and everything else. So the first thing we want to do is have on board some kind of adaptogen. And I'll give you just a very simple cheat sheet here for people. Typically, hypothalamus dysfunction with anxiety, use ashwagandha, typically. Hypothalamus dysfunction with fatigue, use rhodiola, typically. Hypothalamus dysfunction with libido issues and menstrual issues, typically vitex, right? So you can think of it like that. Now, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but I'm just trying to give everyone listening some general tools here. Then on top of that, what you want to do is go back to the stuff that Astrid, you and I do all the time, which is essentially making sure that the tissues, at the tissue level, that the tissues are responding appropriately to insulin. This means movement. Matter of fact, one of the most important things that you can do for PCOS is move. And I don't mean Metcons and CrossFit and weight training and Bikram yoga and this kind of stuff. I mean just walking. Walk. It's one of the best things to take stress off the hypothalamus. It sensitizes the body to insulin. It lowers cortisol. It's basically a stress reliever for this antenna that we have in our brain that's measuring all this stuff for the metabolism. Walking is the thing. Now, a lot of people don't want to do that for whatever reason, because it's not sexy enough or whatever they think it is, but putting adaptogens on board, then putting walking on board. Notice I haven't said anything about cutting carbohydrates way down. Why? Because that can be a stress to the system. Notice how I didn't say anything about doing crazy interval training. Why? Because that could be a stress to the system. This can actually worsen things. So we're being very gentle. Adaptogens for the hypothalamus. Number 2, walking to sensitize the hypothalamus and let it and the tissues, all the tissues, to send the signals to the hypothalamus. The muscle does really, really well with walking, right? If those of you who are a little bit more savvy, movement actually amplifies glucose receptors on the muscle without the need for insulin. That's why walking is so powerful. After that, we get into a little bit more confusing type of stuff. We know the microbiome is probably involved here. Unfortunately, as much as we love this science, and I know you and I are in this science all the time and reading this stuff, we don't yet have a very viable, despite what you've heard out there in the blogosphere, we don't yet have a viable, protocol yet to say these particular probiotics for the gut. So what we need to do there is just amplify our basically vegetable intake. Phytonutrients, phytochemicals, along with fiber, seem to be one of the things that seem to get the microbiome, the gut bacteria moving in the right direction. So we put that on board as well. And then one more thing that I like to do, there's these little energy factories in every cell called the mitochondria. And what ends up happening is these mitochondria, they're like coal factories, right? If they're healthy, they're like a solar factory, solar panels, clean energy, they're burning, they're producing energy. But when they come unhealthy, they come more like coal plants and they start spewing all this smoke into the air. So we want to do something to help the mitochondria function better. Because remember, mitochondria are at the heart of everything, how the hypothalamus generates energy, how the ovaries and the follicles and the eggs and all these things are generating their energy. So we want to make sure we're doing something for the mitochondria. This means good quality essential fats, as well as things like CoQ10, alpha lipoic acid, and supplements like this that can help the mitochondria do a better job. Magnesium, these kinds of things. So to me, this is the best we have for polycystic ovarian syndrome. And keep in mind that there are lean types PCOS and heavy type PCOS. Another clinical pearl that I can tell you about, the lean types seem to be a little bit more stress reactive, and you need to attack cortisol and stress reducing activities a little bit more. The heavy types seem to be a little bit more insulin resistant, and you need to be a little bit more aware of carbohydrate intake and stuff like that in a general way. The reason I bring that up is because a lot of people, if they focus on one mechanism, but the body has 1,000 mechanisms and we only know 2 or 3 of them. And so you can get fat and cause issues through too much insulin through food. You can stress yourself into insulin resistance as well with too much cortisol. And both of these seem to be going on in PCOS. It's just a matter of which. So the lean types seem to be a little bit more stress reactive. The heavy types may be a little bit more insulin resistant. But again, a lot of this is guesswork clinically. We don't have a huge answer for this yet. I know some of you who are worried about PCOS are probably wondering about stuff like, well, what about metformin? My doctor put me on that. And what about other things? Absolutely. We can also put in herbal like drugs or drugs in general. On the herbal side, berberine is a really great one for PCOS that mimics metformin.
Inositol?
Inositol is fantastic for PCOS. For those who are, I know Astrid would choose that because it's a very evidence-based sort of thing to do for PCOS. So if I'm going to give supplements, I would go inositol, berberine, alpha lipoic acid, that kind of stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Now, when we talk about PCOS, there's a lot of suggestions to cut dairy, and because there seems to be some associations with acne. Now, is there really a link established between dairy and acne because of the saturated fat content, or whether it would be any type of dairy?
Yes, there absolutely is a link between dairy and acne. However, when we say this, that does not mean there's a link for you in particular, not meaning you, Astrid, but you, the listeners, who's ever listening to this. There's a genetic issue here. So let's cover acne a little bit. This isn't my area of expertise, but I know a little bit about this. So let's just cover it so we understand. You can kind of think of the keratinocytes, right, where the pilosebaceous glands, right? You can kind of think of them like a little tube. So there's this tiny little tube, and inside that tube, there is skin that is growing, these keratinocytes. And what happens is, as they grow, the layers of the skin grow, and then these things sort of fluff off, right? And so if you're lucky, this all works fine, and no bacteria get trapped in there, and you don't get any inflammation or acne. What happens with insulin, it's primary an insulin thing, and I'll tell you where the connection for dairy comes in again. For some people, their keratinocytes, genetically or for whatever reason, are a little bit more sensitive to insulin, and particular IGF-1 is the chemical, or it's an insulin-like growth factor for those who don't know, but it's insulin-like in its mechanics. And what it does is it stimulates these cells in this little tube to grow faster. And these things start growing much faster and close off this tube. So you can imagine now this tube is closed off. Now, if oil and bacteria get into this tube, what ends up happening is now you start getting an immune reaction, and macrophages start coming in, and they start to create pus trying to kill off this bacteria, and you start seeing this inflamed, raised area, this red inflamed pus area on the skin. What ends up happening is that dairy is very insulinogenic. Now, a lot of times people make that mean, oh, dairy's fattening. No, again, remember, let's go back to calories. But for some people, dairy can be very insulinogenic. By the way, just a brief aside here. Insulin, excess insulin with lots and lots of sugar in lots and lots of glucose is very different than excess insulin and lots of amino acids in the body, right? Excess insulin with lots of amino acids might go to muscle growth versus fat storage. So it's just a little bit different there, just the difference. But for the purposes of this discussion with acne, this IGF-1 insulin production causes overgrowth and then a closing off of this tube. And then that creates the perfect environment for this bacteria to grow. What we do know is that certain people are sensitive to dairy in this way. And that dairy in particular dairy proteins in particular, may result in a particular type of IGF-1. I think it's called IGF-1 BP1 or 2, or maybe it's 3. I forget the actual one, but it's a particular type of IGF that is associated with dairy intake in particular for some people. And so if you notice that you're having lots of acne, you may want to try to do an insulin-free diet or a dairy-free diet first. Now, one of the interesting things about the history, I know you'll be interested in this and you probably know this, but I'll tell people about it. For a long time, they thought that food had nothing to do with acne. And the reason why is because way back in the 60s and 50s when they were doing these studies, they would take certain types of food and they would compare it to other types of food. So they would say, all right, well, let's compare what chocolate does to the skin, a food rich in sugar and fat. But they didn't account for all the other insulin-producing foods in the diet. And so any effect would not have been able to be seen. As we got better with science, we started to realize, well, if we're going to look at insulin, then we can't just look at chocolate. We have to look at all the things that are producing insulin in the body. And so they started to go and look at that, and they started to see, now we know there's an association with very simple carbohydrates that cause a very strong insulin release and dairy foods and a certain amount of people who are susceptible. And so if you want to get rid of these things, oh, and by the way, remember what we talked about hormonally and how estrogen and progesterone interact with this as well? Well, estrogen has receptors in the skin as well. So estrogen can cause some growth in the skin. This is where some of the hormonal acne might come from. So now add estrogen and progesterone into this mix. So the idea here is if you're dealing with acne, yes, cutting out insulin-producing foods, simple sugars, and perhaps dairy. By the way, those who are savvy about dairy, the protein that's probably more important here is probably whey. There's two components to dairy. There's casein and there's whey. Whey, one of the reasons we really like whey in the fitness world is because it's a very quick releasing amino acid that can stimulate insulin and we can grow muscle with it. It also may be a little bit more important with acne. So if you're one of these people who's doing your whey protein shake and struggling with acne, it actually may be partly that. You may find a benefit from switching to maybe casein or maybe away from dairy sort of altogether. And so I know I'm rambling on here, but hopefully I answered all your questions about acne. Was there anything else in that?
I think I wanted to know whether is there any relationship to the fat content of dairy, or like it doesn't have anything to do with it?
Yeah, well, you know, it's really interesting, right? Because remember we talked about this idea that you really can't separate insulin from calories. You just really can't, as much as people want to do that. And so if you add fat with sugar, you will slow the glucose curve, you'll blunt it a little bit, you'll also blunt the insulin curve. However, it still has to deal with all those calories. And so when you add fat onto this, it starts to, at least in terms of fat gain, it starts to amplify calories, which then over time makes you more insulin resistant, perhaps. And so we have to look at not just the acute effects of insulin and calories, but the long-term effects of having excess calories and excess insulin. So from that perspective, fat is playing a role. Now, in terms of fat as a macronutrient having direct signaling effects in the skin, I'm not sure about that. I would think not, because typically fat doesn't have those same hormonal effects. It's one of the reasons why a keto diet, for example, doesn't seem to stimulate some of these same hormones in the same way that maybe protein and carbohydrate do. But I don't know. Are you aware of any studies showing fat in particular playing a role here? I'm not.
I think I've just seen one or two, but doesn't seem to be very reliable. Like they're more like observational studies, not very high level in the hierarchy of research. So I don't trust them very much. I just look at them with a pinch of salt, and like I really want to see more like a clinical trial or a systematic review that can give us a little bit more broad understanding of what is happening. But I guess the insulin part of it makes much more sense to see it that way, and how it might relate to the hormonal changes as well.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting point. If you guys were following what Astrid said there, she's talking about if we're going to do a randomized controlled trial to see if fat was having an impact on acne, we would need to essentially have a very low fat diet along with a higher fat diet and see. And then even when it comes to fat, we'd have to say, all right, well, let's see, does saturated fat versus monounsaturated versus the polyunsaturated fats play a role there? And this is how the science is done. As you can imagine, this is very difficult to tease out sometimes in the science. So like you, sometimes it can be difficult for me to sort of figure this stuff out. But certainly I think we do know there is an association between excess calorie intake in the form of highly palatable foods that combine sugar, starch, salt, fat, alcohol, and obesity, and all these inflammatory conditions, including acne.
Got it. Now let's move to insulin resistance. I'll have one or two questions on that one, and I let you go. There's been quite a few questions on hypothyroidism. Hopefully we can touch maybe in just one question to cover a little bit of it. But with insulin resistance, there's this conundrum whether is insulin resistant makes you fat or vice versa, or is that being fat makes you insulin resistant? Yeah.
I used to be, it's really interesting, right? I used to be on team insulin. Insulin is what's making you fat. Now I'm more that, no, it's sort of the calories that are driving this, and then you become insulin resistant. However, it's probably a little bit of both. What we know with that insulin resistance is not all one thing, by the way, right? You can be insulin resistant in different tissues. For example, you could be insulin resistant at the level of the brain, which would make you extra hungry. You could be insulin resistant at the level of the muscle. You could be insulin resistant at the level of the liver, which would cause your liver to keep pumping out glucose and not ever breaking down glycogen. You could be insulin resistant at the level of the fat cell. And so when we talk about things like diabetes and things like that, we're talking about primarily insulin resistance at the level of the liver and or muscle. So when we talk about insulin resistance, we have to be a little bit careful with that. The other thing here with insulin, the insulin mechanism, is that insulin is driven in many different ways. Both macronutrients, protein will stimulate insulin. That's why I made that comment about high insulin in the context of high blood amino acids. It's very different than high insulin in the context of high blood sugars. The way I think to think about this is that when you are insulin, when you have a lot of insulin around, insulin is a storage and locking hormone. It also happens to be the most anabolic hormone in the body. I say that because if you can't get food in the cell, that cell is not going to grow. So insulin is needed to build muscle. It also happens to be a hunger hormone in the brain. So the idea that we just need to lower insulin is not very smart when you think about the fact that we need it to gain muscle, we need it to feed our cells, and we need it to feel full and satisfied. So the idea is the Goldilocks effect with insulin. Here's what is probably true, and I say probably because we don't know for sure, but if you want a general rule of thumb, if you are in a calorie deficit and you have lots of insulin signaling, right? Let's say lots of carbohydrates, lots of proteins, this kind of stuff, a lot of insulin going on. When you're in a calorie deficit, you are not going to store fat. However, you can burn different fuels, right? You can burn fat or you can burn muscle. When you're a little bit insulin resistant in a calorie deficit, you're probably going to be more likely to take a higher percentage of muscle burning than you are fat burning. Typically in a very strict eat less, exercise more diet in the research, you can lose up to 20% lean body mass. And that includes muscle, water, glycogen, that kind of stuff. But when you're insulin resistant or you have a lot of insulin, if you're trying to do it maybe on a very high carb diet, then, and you're sensitive, you have the genetic sensitivity to insulin, you may end up losing more muscle, but you're still going to lose weight. This is where it may matter, may. Same thing when we're talking about calorie excess. being insulin resistant means that you might be more likely to store more fat and less muscle. Because remember, insulin is playing the game in both places. We can't pick and choose, right? It's not just a storage and locking hormone for fat. It's also one for muscle as well. And so this is the role that insulin is probably playing more of a role in body composition. And much of the research that people like you and I look at, Astrid, is not really looking at that. It simply looks at weight loss and BMI and all this kind of stuff. It's not really teasing out, well, how much did they lose? And I think we'll see further as we get into more of a conversation about body composition changes and controlling insulin. Maybe there we'll see a little bit more of, sort of a smoking gun. But we still have not really seen that when you dig deep into the research. For example, we have an awful lot of studies on the keto diet. It's a very low insulin diet. Compare that to a low calorie diet that's high in carbohydrates. You don't see much difference. And this is what, so what we have to kind of say is let the science guide us. It's probably not playing as big of a role as we would all like in the context of a low calorie diet. That's sort of my take on it.
Very follow-up question before I forget. So when you talk about the insulin resistance, how do you know when insulin resistance is at the level of muscle or at the level of fat tissue or at the level of the brain? When is this happening, and how can you know where it's happening or whether it's systemic?
Yeah, well, we have a tool to do this now, which is fantastic. Continuous glucose monitoring will tell you. So here's what happens. When you are insulin resistant at the level of the liver, think about what insulin does in the liver. What it does is it shuts down gluconeogenesis and it shuts down glycogenolysis, right? So what happens is now you're insulin resistant at the level of the liver. This means that when you take your blood sugar, your fasting blood sugar is going to be high. It also means when you eat sugar, your sugar is going to spike in a huge way. It's going to go above 140, probably closer to 200. So whenever you see a huge spike after you eat on a blood sugar monitor, that probably means your insulin, especially if it starts high and goes super high, that means you are insulin resistant at the level of the liver probably. Now, if you see it go up and stay up and hover almost like a plateau, because the muscle is what sucks the glucose out of the bloodstream. So if you see it go up and crash down, you're probably insulin resistant at the level of the liver, but sensitive at the muscle. However, if you see it go up and stay up, you're probably resistant at the level of the muscle. Why does this make a difference? Because if you're resistant at the level of the liver, this means you really got to focus on diet. Cut the carbs out of your diet. If you're resistant at the level of the muscle, it means you need to move more, get out walking and make sure that your muscles are being stimulated. It actually does guide you a little bit on what's more important for you, diet or exercise, right? Now we want to remain, not to confuse everyone, but we want to remain resistant to, the ideal thing would be able to be resistant to insulin at the level of the fat cell, right? Because if we're resistant to insulin at the level of the fat cell, it means we store less fat. However, this is just a tricky argument. Think about this. One of the reasons we store fat so readily in a high insulin state is to get it out of the bloodstream. We do not want a lot of glucose and fat hanging out in the bloodstream a lot. And if we are resistant at the level of the fat cell, we may be storing that in the arteries. And this is why you see a lot of these people who are very thin, who just genetically maybe are more insulin resistant at the level of the fat cell. Maybe they end up storing more fat in their arteries and things like that, end up dying at 50. Isn't it interesting where we can see these people who are very, very thin genetically, but also have advanced cardiovascular disease? It may actually be a result of being insulin resistant at the level of the fat tissue. So they might look better, but they're certainly not healthier from a functional perspective. So that's why some of these individuals who are a little bit overweight, perhaps, it may actually be better because they'll die at 80 or 70 from diabetes rather than at 40 from a massive MI. Does that make sense? Kind of an aside there, but hopefully that gives you enough. And by the way, you'll know if you're resistant at the level of the brain because you'll eat food, especially things like carbohydrates, and you'll have what is known as like this reactive hypoglycemia. It won't even necessarily show up on a blood sugar, but your brain will crave the thing again. If you've ever had a donut and then want the donut again and it doesn't suppress your hunger, that's a good way of thinking you're being more insulin resistant at the level of the brain. So hopefully that's a good guide. And you can do this with a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, or you can do it with a regular glucose monitor.
Okay, that's good. What about like when you were mentioning about the donut, like would it mean that it was so delicious that you want more, and might not necessarily be that is an actual resistance of insulin resistance in the brain. Might be just like it's so highly palatable, it increases your dopamine production, serotonin, you just want to feel more for an extended period of time. How do you differentiate whether it is more like an excitement about having eaten that food, or whether it's insulin resistant at the level of the brain?
Yeah, you're always so sharp, which is why I love talking to you. It's actually more likely to be what you just described. When you get hungry after eating junk food, it's cravings. It's usually as a result of this highly palatable thing. But this gets into a discussion of craving versus hunger. So if you feel full, like almost like your gut is empty all the time, this may be the brain-gut connection, and it may be related to insulin resistance at the level of the brain. A craving is like, I just need to taste more. I need to taste more, or I'm bored and I want to eat. Hunger is felt more in the gut. Insulin is probably involved with both, but I would say, and this is again as a guess, but I would say the way to distinguish this, if you're feeling hungry and empty quickly after eating foods, and you're getting cravings, it might be more of an insulin thing. However, if it's like I ate donuts and I want more donuts and I want pizza too, this may be just related to this highly palatable impact. And by the way, what Astrid just brought up there is really interesting, because I think what we will see is we are going to start to see that the neurolingual connection of taste and textures is playing a pretty significant role, I think, this is a guess, but we'll see, in these hormonal kinetics like insulin and leptin and these kinds of things. And this is why, my theory is that this is one of the reasons why when you're using highly palatable, low calorie things like stevia and sucralose and Splenda and things like that, some of these people are responding negatively to those, because I believe they're still creating this neurolingual response, the tongue-brain connection, and eliciting some of these negative hormonal states that cause excess hunger and cravings later.
I hope you enjoyed this episode, and make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell button so I can provide you with more information every time I upload a video. So stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you so much.
Okay, it makes sense to point certain people that might say, well, just eating, even adding artificial sweeteners is not something that is helping me. And you might point, well, probably there is something to do with what you just described, but might not necessarily be for everyone. For some people, utilizing artificial sweeteners might be a tool to actually improve the weight loss or the adherence to the diet. So it is very individual, and I guess this is when it gets very confusing with the science and try to prove or get a consensus of what is the truth behind all of these things.
Yeah, and you bring up such an important point, because when I'm talking about these high potency, I'm saying it's a guess. It's not a guess that high calorie intake is going to get you fat. That's not a guess. We know that is the case. And so it's very astute. We can play all these games in our head about, well, I think this is happening, I think this is happening. But the truth is, we already know, the one thing the science is clear on is that high calorie diets are the thing that is leading to obesity. Back in the 90s, when I was first writing books and getting into this, I didn't actually believe that. But the data is, in my mind, very clear. I used to think, no, this is all about insulin. If I had to pick one now, it's both, by the way, you can't separate the two. But if I had to pick one now, it's definitely more calories. We've seen it because we've had more and more studies. And so those of you who are on the insulin train, I would just essentially say, one, insulin and calories aren't really separable in the way that you think they are. Quality and quantity are essentially the same thing. And two, we now have a lot of data over the last 20 years since I first started doing this work that points to, including studies on intermittent fasting and keto diets and all the things that people think are about insulin. And we actually show, in terms of weight loss, there's probably not a big difference. Where it may make a difference, like we said, is with body composition and metabolic health and certain diseases. But certainly with weight loss, it seems to be calories first in whatever way you can reduce those calories. And that's a huge discussion, by the way. So yes, it's relatively simple, but it actually means controlling hunger and energy and cravings and the way we eat, socializing around food, and all of these kinds of things that you and I deal with on a regular basis. Food is not sort of a thing in itself. It's highly related to our history, the way we grew up, how we eat around people, all of this kind of stuff.
Sounds amazing. Now let's move to one more question on Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism. So at least we touched on that.
Yes.
Do you feel like hypothyroidism is the same as Hashimoto, or is there other ways to describe hypothyroidism, maybe not necessarily related with Hashimoto?
Yeah, they're not the same thing, although they do cause some of the same reaction. Hypothyroid can be secondary or primary hypothyroidism. Remember we talked about the hypothalamus pituitary axes? Well, you can have something go wrong with the hypothalamus where the thyroid doesn't get the signal. The thyroid is capable of making hormone, it's just not getting a signal. This would be a secondary hypothyroidism. You also can have something go wrong in the gland. Maybe you don't have enough iodine or something like that, which is one of the more common things to cause hypothyroid. Now, Hashimoto's thyroiditis is a very specific problem going on in the gland. So it's a primary hypothyroidism caused by an autoimmune condition where the immune system is attacking thyroid cells and disrupting the ability for the thyroid to make that hormone. So they are very different. Now, here's what we now know that is tricky here. A lot of conventional doctors, not because they don't like you or they don't know the information, they don't necessarily have the same dietary tools, and the science is a little bit tricky here. They will just look at TSH and say you're hypothyroid and put you on thyroid medications. The reason they don't go looking for Hashimoto's is because even if they found it, they don't have a different treatment. The treatment would still be Synthroid or a thyroid hormone. Now, for people like me who are a functional medicine practitioner, I have seen not once, not twice, not a few times, but many, many times the ability to take someone, change their diet around, and see these antibodies to the thyroid gland go away, and also see the thyroid pick back up its own production once we clear that autoimmune. A lot of doctors don't have the background to be able to do that particular work. So they are very different, and you do want to distinguish between the two, because if you have Hashimoto's, there are people who specialize in that who can actually perhaps, and I would say maybe 20% of my cases, that I've done this with can be off thyroid hormone, and it's probably 20% because the other 80% can't do the diet. It's incredibly hard to do some of the things we do, like removing gluten and taking dairy out and fixing the microbiome and doing some gut rehabilitation and all this kind of stuff. But it does make a difference in treatment. So the two they are different. You really do want to know the difference, and the treatment is a little bit different. However, I will say this. I'm a naturopathic physician, so I use drugs and natural therapies. If you are diagnosed with a thyroid condition, the best bet is to get on thyroid medications. You can do natural, or you can do the other. I tend to like to use, something like an Armour thyroid that's a mix of T3 and T4. However, you still want to be doing the things that we talked about. For example, hypothalamus stuff that we talked about before, and also fixing some of the stuff that goes on at the level of the gut, which is a whole different conversation. And it's a lot of clinical artistry right now. What I mean by that is we don't have the science to back up a lot of what we're doing in clinic right now. So, medicine is always a bit of art and science, right? So you got the science, and then on the fringe, when you're dealing with things like PCOS and Hashimoto's that we don't know a whole lot about, there's an art process that's going on. There's a lot of guesswork. And then we have to go and look and say, what's Astrid doing to treat this? And what's Jade doing to treat this? And what's this person over here doing to treat this? And what are their outcomes? And what are the things that we might be able to use? And this is where these things that you guys hear about, like gut restoration programs and this thing and that thing, are coming from. What we have to remember, though, is that these things have not been fully vetted, and we want them to be, because good science helps us refine these approaches. Some of the things we're doing might be useless, where some of the things may be really, really good. And we want to tease those things out so we can say, you know what, that particular probiotic we were using wasn't doing anything, but there's something about using digestive enzymes and fasting along with glutamine to help the gut. And we want to know that. We don't necessarily yet.
Do you think you could heal Hashimoto's? Is that something that is possible? No
question. It's like I've said, I've seen it. I've done it numerous times in clinic. It can absolutely be healed. These antibodies go away. I myself have Hashimoto's. And when I'm not sticking on my diet, those antibodies go up, and I have issues. And when I am, and I'm being really good, those antibodies go away and I don't need my thyroid hormone, and I can get away with just a little bit of ashwagandha and feel great. And so absolutely, this matters. And it's funny because this particular discussion, people say, oh, well, Hashimoto's is one of these diseases that waxes and wanes anyway. Part of the reason I think it waxes and wanes is because our adherence to a healthy diet oftentimes waxes and wanes. And this is one of the reasons why we can re-trigger some of this stuff. One of the things we know now, if you're someone listening to this and you are dealing with autoimmune, the science is not clear yet, but we do know this, that the gut immune connection is involved in probably every autoimmune disease. We don't yet know exactly how to use that information, but many of us in the functional medicine world are doing pretty amazing things with not just Hashimoto's, but other autoimmune conditions as well. Rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot that we can do. We just are not 1000% clear on how it's all working yet.
If you could say few tips to someone who is living with Hashimoto's to improve their diet, what would be those tips?
Well, a couple things. One of the ones that's big, if you're on thyroid hormone, that I'll tell everyone right now, a lot of people don't know that a lot of people take their thyroid hormone first thing in the morning. They take it with coffee. Coffee will decrease the potency of that thyroid hormone by 20, 30, maybe 40%. And so make sure you're taking if you're on thyroid meds, take it away from coffee and any food. That's one of the first things. The other thing is, this is not rocket science, right? Think about moving to a diet that is mostly the things that Astrid and I have already been talking about. Lean protein, tons of vegetables. Soup, salad, scrambled shakes, and stir fries is the way that I like to describe this. In fact, low carb, low fat, soup, salad, scrambled shakes, and stir fries. Not because there's anything wrong with fat, not because there's anything wrong with carbs. It's just that those are where all the calories come from. So what you really want is a couple things, what I would call a metabolic diet. It's a diet that's low in calories, a diet that's very nutrient dense, and a diet that is very hunger suppressing. That is low calorie, low carb rather, low fat soup, salad, scrambled shakes, and stir fries. Move to that diet. Also get out and walk like crazy. Again, lots of repeat here. Maybe use some adaptogens, and that's the first thing. Now, there is one other clinical pearl that I'll give you, and I just know that you, Astrid, love this stuff, and you'll chase this down, and maybe you and I will talk about it. But certainly one of the things is pollutants. People, I hate this word, by the way. I'm a naturopath, and I hate this word. Toxins. Everyone's talking about toxins. However, if we're going to talk about toxins, we should talk about what might be playing a role on the thyroid gland. Persistent organic pollutants. These are chemicals of industry. These are the bisphenols, especially bisphenol A being the most popular one. By the way, plastic things that say no bisphenol A oftentimes have other bisphenols in there, pesticides and things like that. These things are stored in our fat tissue. When we lose weight, they are released, and they disrupt the thyroid in ways that science is very clear on. They disrupt the ability to make thyroid in the thyroid gland. They disrupt T4 to T3 conversion, and they they actually increase elimination of thyroid. And so one of the things that oftentimes I'm doing with people who are dealing with thyroid, which is a very sensitive organ, I call it a sentinel organ, like the sentinel guards in a castle. The castle gets attacked, those guards get killed first. The thyroid is the first thing to get hit by stress, partly because of its connection to the hypothalamus. But if you want to get rid of these persistent organic pollutants, which I am starting to see play a huge role in thyroid function and many people's ability to lose weight, sweat therapies is the way to go. And so one of the clinical pearls I can give everybody on this call right now is that if you're trying to lose weight and you think that you are dealing with thyroid related issues, poor skin, thin hair, foggy brain, all of these kinds of things, sweat therapy needs to become part of what you're doing. Sauna, infrared sauna, hot Epsom salt baths. Get in there and sweat 20 to 30 minutes, 3 to 5 times per week. And what you will oftentimes see in these individuals is some of these things will begin to clear up. So hopefully that helps.
What if you exercise instead of using a sauna, for example? Can you sweat it out?
Absolutely. In hot environments, exercise will do it as well. And the reason I didn't focus on that necessarily is because I oftentimes forget that. So I'm glad you brought it up. Many times the people that I'm dealing with clinically simply don't have the energy to do the exercise that people like you and I would want them to do. And so sauna therapy becomes huge there. And also not everyone, unfortunately, I think if you're going to exercise, people should get used to a hot gym so they can sweat. But many of these gyms have fans on you, have ACs on. A lot of people just simply can't sweat during exercise anymore because they got these fans blowing on them. And so even if you are going to sweat during exercise, I still think some kind of sweat therapy is the missing link in a lot of people's approach.
Okay. Jade, I appreciate your time. I can't thank you enough for being here and being able to drop all these bombs and this knowledge that you always do. Thank you so much again, and I hope to see you soon. Where people could find you. Is there any project, anything coming up from your side?
No, you guys can just follow me at Jade Teta here. So just, click over to this link. And Astrid, I love you. I love your work. Thanks for all you do. And thanks for having me, my friend.
Thank you so much. A big hug.
Big hug
Bye-bye.
to you too. See you, everybody.
Thank you so much for being watching. I appreciate you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions or any comments, please comment below and I'll be sure I'll answer to this as soon as I can.